Hey guys, tonight we travel back to the foggy fields of 15th century France, where a barefoot peasant girl claimed she heard the voices of saints while tending sheep, and ended up commanding armies, crowning kings, and getting burned alive at the stake. Her name was Joan. And whether you think she was divinely inspired or dangerously delusional, her story is one of the strangest, most intense rises and falls in medieval history. We'll follow every smoky trail of her short, brutal journey, from her muddy childhood to the fire that turned her into both a heretic and a hero. Before you relax and fall asleep, please take a second to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. And be sure to leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fun to see viewers from all over the world. Now turn off the lights, grab a soft pillow, take a deep breath, and immerse yourself in tonight's story. The village of Domremy looked like it had been forgotten by time, and perhaps by God. Nestled in northeastern France, it was a place of stone cottages, wind-bent trees, and peasants who aged quickly and died quietly. Except for one girl. Joan was born in 1412. No royal fanfare, no ominous prophecies. Just a squirming baby wrapped in scratchy linen, one more mouth to feed in a world already starved by war and disease. Historians still argue whether she was literate, spoiler. Probably not. But they agree on this. Joan had an intensity that made people uneasy. By age 13 she was already talking about saints. And not in a charming Sunday school way. She said Saint Michael had appeared to her in her father's garden, glowing and sword drawn. That's not the kind of thing a humble farm girl was supposed to say. People whispered. Her parents panicked. Her priest nodded and said, "How lovely," the way you do when someone tells you they've seen angels and you're trying not to get stabbed. But Joan didn't just hear voices, she obeyed them. They told her France was dying and only she could save it. That a young girl, dirt under her fingernails, no military training, zero political clout, would somehow restore a broken kingdom and drive out the English. The 100 Years' War had already drained France of its nobility, its treasury, and honestly, its will to live. So why not? Maybe they did need a teenage visionary with a bowl haircut. She cut her hair short, started dressing like a boy, and left her home without permission. That last part especially scandalized her neighbors, because clearly the real concern was modesty, not divine military campaigns. One mainstream fact: by the time Joan began her public mission, France was in tatters. The English and their Burgundian allies had taken Paris, most of the north, and Charles VII, technically the Dauphin, or heir, was king in name only, holed up in Chinon with a crown no one had actually put on his head. But Joan, she said Charles would be crowned, that she would make it happen. She convinced a local captain to give her an escort to Chinon. It took weeks to get an audience, but when she finally stood before Charles, she recognized him even though he was hiding among courtiers, just to test her. And that's when people started taking her seriously. Here's a quirky historical tidbit. Joan claimed that her voices told her a secret only Charles knew, something she whispered to him during their first meeting. To this day we don't know what it was. Charles never told anyone, not even his priests, which makes you wonder, what on earth did she say? Was it divine knowledge? Political blackmail? A very lucky guess? We'll never know. But what we do know is that soon after she was put in full armor, handed a banner, and sent to the battlefield. Let that sink in. In a society where most women couldn't own property or travel alone without being arrested for heresy, Joan, barely a teenager, was given a command post in a national war effort. It's like promoting the babysitter to commander of the Pentagon. Modern historians still debate whether she actually led troops in the field or served more as a mascot. But what's clear is that she inspired men to fight. Hardened soldiers, nobles, mercenaries, all following this tiny girl with a sword because she somehow made them believe, even if they weren't sure what they believed in anymore. And back home, Domremy just kept churning through the seasons. Chickens squawked, wheat was harvested, and Joan's name began to echo in fireside gossip and nervous prayers. One night, a woman in the village said she dreamed of Joan walking across water. Another said she saw her glowing. A third said, "She was always weird. I told you she was weird." And meanwhile, Joan was preparing for war, not with rage or hatred, but with the steady resolve of someone who'd already seen the ending. Someone who believed that destiny wasn't just a word. It was marching orders. Joan didn't ride into battle like a noble knight out of legend. There were no trumpets, no polished steeds. She rode with mud on her boots, a makeshift banner in hand, and the calm certainty of someone who believed God was her general. The first time her new allies saw her in armor, they probably expected her to tip over. Let's be honest, plate mail is not exactly petite girl friendly. But she stood straighter than most men and refused to carry a sword she hadn't blessed herself. She claimed St. Catherine told her to carry a banner instead, something white, embroidered with lilies and the names of Jesus and Mary. Yes, she marched into war wielding divine embroidery. And it worked. The English called her the witch before she even showed up. But it wasn't just bravado. Joan, though barely 17, seemed to know things about troop movements and enemy morale that she shouldn't have. Historians still argue whether she had secret informants, uncanny intuition, or actual divine guidance. All we know is that when she spoke, people listened, and not out of politeness. At Blois, she ordered the army to confess their sins, ban prostitutes from camp, and march in formation while singing hymns. Some rolled their eyes. Some muttered behind her back. But they obeyed, because somehow when she said that heaven was watching, it didn't sound like a metaphor. It sounded like a weather report. "Tomorrow," she'd say, "we will strike." And they did. Her first major campaign was the Siege of Orleans. 4 months, the English had surrounded the city, strangling it into desperation. Joan arrived like a thunderclap. Her presence alone was enough to boost morale. Suddenly, people believed again. Peasants sharpened pitchforks. Nobles found their lost courage. The sick and starving leaned out of windows just to glimpse her riding past. But not everyone was thrilled. The men in charge, older, grizzled commanders, resented taking orders from a teenager who claimed to hear angels. One general called her a meddling girl in trousers. She called him a coward and told him to confess his sins. Guess who got the louder applause? Now here's a delightful fringe fact. During one battle, Joan supposedly asked for a loaf of bread, had it blessed by a priest, and then handed it to the troops like it was holy armor. One soldier later swore it turned a blade aside. Was it miracle wheat or battlefield morale? You decide. But even skeptics had to admit, when Joan showed up, things changed. The siege of Orleans was brutal. Arrows rained from above. Fires devoured buildings. And Joan, with her banner held high, stood on the front lines screaming encouragement while other commanders cowered behind carts. She didn't fight with weapons, she fought with presence. And then came the arrow. On May 7, 1429, during an assault on the English stronghold called the Tourelles, Joan took a crossbow bolt straight to the shoulder. Witnesses said she fell hard. Some thought she was dead. But within hours she pulled the arrow out herself, prayed over the wound, and insisted on returning to the battlefield that same evening. Modern scholars debate whether that injury was survivable without infection or surgical aid, but apparently divine mandates come with really solid health insurance. The English, watching her reappear on the ramparts hours after being shot, probably started sweating through their armor. The French rallied, surged forward, and won. Orleans was free. That victory did more than lift a siege. It revived a nation. For the first time in years, the French had a symbol. Not a prince in a velvet robe. Not a papal decree. But a farm girl who'd never held a sword in anger until that spring. And guess what? The miracles weren't over. Joan didn't stop with Orleans. He had a mission. Her voices told her that Charles must be crowned king, properly in the cathedral at Reims as tradition demanded. The only problem? Reims was deep in enemy territory, but details never stopped Joan. She marched with Charles and his court through hostile lands, facing cities that could easily have turned them in. Instead, many opened their gates, hoping for a glimpse of the girl in shining armor. People handed her babies to bless. One mayor offered her a suit of gold armor, which she declined because, direct quote, "God does not ask me to shine, burn, but the crown, that she wanted to shine." In July 1429, Charles was crowned King of France in Reims, just as Joan had predicted. She stood beside him, weeping, her white banner raised higher than any sword. She had no title, no official power, just the unmistakable presence of someone fulfilling fate. Mainstream historians agree. Without Joan, Charles likely would never have taken the crown. He certainly wouldn't have done it with a choir singing behind him and half of France calling it a miracle. Of course, miracles have a short shelf life. And not everyone loves a woman in armor making kings out of cowards. Back in court, the whispering had already begun. Who gave her permission to speak to heaven? Who told her she could lead armies? And worst of all, what happens when heaven stops answering? But Joan wasn't listening to courtiers or skeptics. She had saints in her ear, and one more war to win. Joan's victory at Reims should have been her swan song. A young girl crowned a king, fulfilled her divine mission, and became a national hero. Cue the curtain, roll credits, right? But Joan wasn't interested in dramatic exits. She was still listening to those voices. And they weren't telling her to go home and bake bread. They were telling her to take Paris. Yes, Paris. As in the most fortified, most politically volatile city in all of France. Still under English and Burgundian control, and guarded by men who weren't exactly going to roll out a red carpet for a peasant prophet. But Joan didn't flinch. She believed her mission wasn't done until the whole of France was free. And unfortunately for her, that included marching into the jaws of a city that had seen more sieges than festivals. Charles VII, now finally king, wasn't so eager. He'd gotten what he wanted, his shiny crown, his big cathedral moment. Why risk it all on one girl's holy hunch? But Joan pushed. She begged him to strike while the enemy was reeling. And at first he agreed. But the momentum was already shifting. Some nobles had begun to whisper that Joan was getting strange. That her divine confidence was slipping into fanaticism. That her insistence on purity, prayer, and pushing forward without rest was wearing down the army's morale. And maybe, just maybe, she was becoming more trouble than she was worth. Historians still argue whether Charles began distancing himself out of political strategy or genuine fear that Joan's mystique was starting to unravel. Either way, when she finally approached Paris in September 1429, she didn't have the full weight of the crown behind her. She had a smaller force, fewer supplies, and a growing list of men who were ready to see her fail. The attack on Paris was grim. Joan took a crossbow bolt to the thigh and had to be dragged off the battlefield, kicking and screaming to be let back in. She reportedly wept and blamed the failure not on God, but on human cowardice. A fair assessment, considering Charles pulled the plug on the campaign soon after and sent Joan away for her safety. That's usually royal speak for, "Please stop making me look bad." She was given a coat of arms, sure, 2 fleurs de lis and a sword. But she also got fewer messengers, less funding, and a sudden cold shoulder from the man she'd literally lifted onto a throne. Kings have short memories when it comes to miracles. Now here's a quirky tidbit you didn't learn in history class. Joan supposedly once told a squire that she'd rather die than betray her mission. He laughed. He didn't. And then she added, "It will happen sooner than you think." Spooky foreshadowing or just a moody teenager with a flair for drama? You decide. By the spring of 1430, Joan was still trying to stir the pot. She rode north to defend the city of Compiègne against the Burgundians, despite being told to stand down. She couldn't help herself. When the people cried for help, she went. She believed her voices were calling her back into the fire. And the fire was waiting. On May 23, 1430, Joan led a small sortie against Burgundian forces. It was chaotic, uneven, and doomed from the start. Her side began to retreat. She stayed behind to cover them. Why? Because Joan didn't run. Not from arrows. Not from siege towers. Not even from betrayal. And betrayal is exactly what she got. As she fell behind the retreating line, the city gates of Compiègne slammed shut on her. Not by accident. Not in confusion. But as a strategic move to protect the town from further invasion. Joan was outside, exposed and alone. The Burgundians took her quickly. No final duel. No cinematic last stand. Just a girl on a tired horse, yanked down and surrounded by men who hated what she represented. Divine authority in a woman's body, bravery without permission, faith that didn't ask for church approval. Captured and shackled, Joan was handed over like property. But the truth? She was far more valuable than gold. You see, her enemies didn't want her dead. Not right away. They wanted her discredited. They needed to prove that her voices were false, her victories were flukes, and her gender, an abomination in armor. The Burgundians knew who'd pay a high price for such a trophy. The English. And pay they did. They bought Joan like she was livestock, £16,000 tournois to be exact. The Church of England, working closely with the English crown, was all too eager to get their hands on the Maid of Orleans. This wasn't a war prisoner. This was a theological time bomb. And they were ready to light the fuse. Now, mainstream historians agree. Joan's capture marked a chilling shift from war hero to political scapegoat. She wasn't being tried by enemy soldiers, she was being tried by priests. And that meant rules no longer applied. She was taken to Rouen, placed in a cold stone cell and chained hand, foot, and neck. They treated her like a wild animal. And all the while they smiled and told the world they were saving her soul. Here's the final kicker of this section. Even in chains, Joan refused to despair. One guard reported that he saw her praying at night, softly weeping, not for herself but for France. Another said she asked for more straw, not for comfort, but to make sure the rats wouldn't crawl over her while she slept. Because even saints get bitten by rats. And even miracles can be caged. The cell in Rouen was small, damp, and dark. Stone walls that sweated with cold, iron chains that clanked with every shift of her body. Joan, barely 19 now, slept on straw, wrapped in nothing but a rough blanket and a silence that gnawed louder than rats. And yet she prayed, constantly, to saints who had once spoken in shining fields but were now quiet behind stone. But outside that cell, something worse was being constructed. Her trial. Let's be clear. This wasn't a fair legal proceeding. It was theater. Church officials handpicked by the English. A bishop named Pierre Cauchon at the helm, and a courtroom stacked with clergy who'd already decided the ending. All they needed now was the script. Preferably one where Joan admitted she was a heretic, a liar, and a witch. Bonus points if she cried while doing it. Cauchon claimed the trial was spiritual, not political. Sure. And I'm a magical goat herder from Mars. The charges were long, contradictory, and bizarre. Witchcraft. Cross-dressing. Speaking to demons disguised as saints. Practicing magic. Claiming to hear voices not sanctioned by the church. And, of course, the classic. Defying the natural order by leading men into battle. Historians still argue whether Cauchon genuinely believed Joan was dangerous or was just trying to curry favor with the English. But either way, he ran the courtroom like a wolf in cassock robes, predatory, methodical, and very, very hungry for a confession. But Joan, she wouldn't play along. She was interrogated over 20 times, sometimes for hours. She stood, untrained in theology, and faced a firing squad of scholars who tried to outmaneuver her with technical questions about God, church hierarchy, and obscure doctrine. But Joan answered with instinct, with faith, with fire. Sometimes she stumbled, but sometimes she turned their traps into punchlines. When asked if she was in God's grace, a question that could trap anyone into heresy no matter the answer, she replied, "If I am not, may God put me there. And if I am, may he keep me there." Mic drop. Even her enemies had to admit the girl could hold her own. Now here's a fringe historical tidbit. Some guards claimed that Joan, though imprisoned and watched around the clock, would sometimes glow faintly in the dark. Probably exaggeration, possibly poor torchlight. Definitely fuel for the fire. The English didn't just fear her ideas, they feared her presence. To make her easier to discredit, she was denied a proper prison for women. Instead, she was kept in a military tower and guarded by male soldiers who harassed and taunted her. She had no privacy, no peace. And yet she refused to break. She refused to say the voices were fake. She refused to say her mission was madness. And she refused, most of all, to wear a dress. Yes, that's right. One of the most controversial charges against Joan was that she wore men's clothing. Pants, tunics, armor. Not because she was trying to make a fashion statement, but because, in her words, it helped her move freely, kept her safe from assault, and was what God commanded. The court lost its collective mind over this. Historians still debate whether her attire was symbolic defiance or simply practical in a time of war and imprisonment. But the clerics treated it like a mortal sin. They begged her to change. They bribed. They threatened. She kept her boots laced and her jaw clenched. And so the trial dragged on. One mainstream fact: Joan was denied legal counsel. No one defended her. No advocate. No representation. Just her, in chains, surrounded by hostile theologians, trying to explain why the creator of the universe might speak to a teenage girl with a sword and zero Latin vocabulary. And yet, she never once said she'd made it all up. In the rare moments she faltered, it wasn't because of doctrine. It was fear, fatigue, isolation. Once she signed a confession under pressure, after threats of torture and possibly rape. But within days she took it back. Ripped it up, metaphorically if not literally. She knew what it meant. That she was signing her death warrant. And she did it anyway. Joan said she would rather die than betray what she knew was true. That's not dramatic storytelling. That's her exact statement to the court. And it shook even her accusers. One cleric reportedly said, "She has more courage than any man I've ever met." But courage doesn't always win. Not when the verdict was written before the trial even began. One of the saddest ironies: Charles VII, the man whose head she placed a crown on, made no move to rescue her. No ransom. No letter. Not even a formal protest. Mainstream historians generally agree. Politically, Joan had become a liability. Spiritually, she was radioactive. And so, as spring 1431 rolled in, the court moved toward the inevitable conclusion. They weren't looking for truth. They were looking for ashes. Because to kill Joan's message, they needed to kill her body, and bury it so deep in scandal, no one would dare remember her as anything other than a burned-out mistake. But Joan's final moments hadn't arrived yet. She still had more to say. Still had her banner in memory. Still believed in the voices. Still refused to bow. Even as the firewood was being stacked in secret, Joan was praying in her cell. Not for vengeance, not even for herself, but for those who would one day believe her. Because somewhere deep down she knew. Ashes don't whisper. But legends, they scream. By the time dawn broke on May 24, 1431, Rouen had the hush of a city holding its breath. The cobbled streets were damp with mist, and every echo, hoofbeats, church bells, whispered prayers, felt like it carried more weight than usual. Word had spread. The girl who saw saints, who led armies, who crowned a king, was going to be burned alive. Except not yet. The trial still had one last twist to play. That morning, Joan was led out onto a wooden platform in the churchyard of St. Ouen. A crowd gathered, some curious, some angry, some hoping for a miracle. She was surrounded by clerics, guards, and the ever-watchful Bishop Cauchon, who had one goal left: to get her to submit. Not just admit fault, but publicly denounce her visions as false, her mission as blasphemy, and her own self as nothing more than a deluded fraud in pants. And for a moment, it worked. Broken by months of isolation, threatened with immediate burning, Joan agreed to sign a document. It was short, vague, and possibly even altered after the fact. But the point was made: she would abandon her errors and dress as a woman again. To the English it was a win. To the church it was a loophole. To Joan, it was a torment, because just days later she was found wearing men's clothes again. The reasons are still debated by historians. Some say the guards stole her dress to trick her into relapsing. Others claim she did it willingly to avoid sexual assault in prison. Joan herself reportedly said, "They promised to move me to a proper place among women and they lied." So she put the trousers back on. And with that act, practical, defiant, or desperate, they declared her a relapsed heretic. And that, under the Church's law, was unforgivable. No more trials. No more questioning. Just the fire. Now here's a strange, often overlooked historical tidbit. One English soldier who'd mocked Joan during the trial was said to have gone mad days before her execution. He claimed he saw angels weeping outside her window and begged forgiveness from the guards before collapsing. Was it guilt? Hallucination? Medieval drama? Either way, it gave some pause, just not the ones with power. On May 30th, 1431, they came for her at dawn. They dressed her in a simple white gown, symbolic of purity, or maybe just irony. She was led through the streets on a cart, flanked by Dominican friars. A wooden placard hung around her neck reading, "Heretic, relapsed, apostate, idolatress," in case anyone missed the memo. She was 19 years old. One mainstream fact often forgotten is that even among her enemies, not everyone approved. Several eyewitnesses wrote that they wept, that she prayed aloud, that she forgave those who condemned her. One account said the executioner was so disturbed, he later confessed to a priest in tears, asking whether he'd damned his soul. And yet they followed orders. The marketplace of Rouen was already filling with smoke when Joan arrived. A tall wooden stake had been driven into the ground. Around it, piled high, were carts of kindling and bundles of dry branches, enough to turn the square into a furnace. They tied her to the post with ropes and an iron chain, to make sure she wouldn't slump or fall. She asked for a cross. A soldier fashioned one from 2 twigs and handed it to her. Another priest held a crucifix high so she could see it as the flames rose. What happened next is recorded in chilling detail. She cried out Jesus again and again. Witnesses said she never cursed, never screamed in rage, only prayed. Her eyes fixed on the cross as the smoke curled around her feet. And then the fire. It started slow. Smoke before flame. The crowd grew quiet. No jeering now. No mockery. Just the crackling of wood and the occasional sob. A woman fainted. A child began to wail. The friars knelt and whispered Latin. And Joan? She didn't look away. The fire climbed, fast and cruel, but she remained upright. Some say her body didn't collapse even after she died. Others say the wind parted the smoke just long enough for everyone to see her face, calm, defiant, and shining. Even the executioner turned away. Here's the most haunting part. After the flames had done their work, after her body was reduced to bone and ash, the heart remained, whole, unburned. Several chroniclers wrote that it refused to blacken, refused to break. They had to burn it separately. You can believe that or not. Maybe it's a myth. Maybe it's metaphor. But maybe it's something else. They scattered her ashes in the Seine. No grave. No marker. No resting place. Just smoke and water, and the uneasy silence of a crime disguised as justice. The English hoped that would be the end of it. That she'd vanish into legend as a cautionary tale. That people would forget. But they didn't. Because you can burn a girl. You can silence her voice. But you can't kill a symbol. Joan had become something else. Something they couldn't chain or mock or drown in legalese. She had become eternal. In the days that followed the execution, the city of Rouen was quieter than usual. The English authorities, always wary of uprisings, patrolled with extra caution. But no one was throwing stones or raising fists. Instead, something stranger settled in, an uncomfortable stillness. Because while the fire had done its job, burned a young woman to ash and scattered her into the Seine, what it couldn't erase was the memory. The image of Joan at the stake lingered in the minds of everyone who saw it. Not as a heretic, not even as a martyr, but as a girl who refused to break even in the face of flame. And that's terrifying in its own way. The French public was left shaken. News of her death spread fast, faster than even the English could contain it. And the narrative, no matter how tightly the church tried to control it, was slipping. Word of mouth became gospel. Whispered stories became testimony. People said the executioner wept. People said the pigeons wouldn't fly over the square anymore. People said her heart didn't burn. Now here's a quirky little fact that often gets brushed aside. Years after Joan's death, rumors swirled that she had survived, that a decoy had taken her place at the stake, that she had escaped and was living quietly under an assumed name. One woman even claimed to be Joan and fooled several nobles for years, including one of Joan's own brothers. It was eventually debunked, but it speaks volumes that the lie was easier to believe than the truth, that a peasant girl had stood up to kings and clergy, led an army, and been murdered for it. And what about Charles VII, the king she crowned? He said nothing, did nothing. No public mourning, no monument, no defense. Historians still argue why. Some say it was political self-preservation. Aligning himself too closely with a condemned heretic could damage his fragile legitimacy. Others say he genuinely felt ashamed, even haunted, and couldn't face the truth of what had been done. But for 20 years he remained silent, until something shifted. In 1450, with the English power in France finally waning, Charles authorized a posthumous inquiry into Joan's trial. It wasn't an act of grief, it was an act of strategy. He wanted to clear the name of the very girl he once abandoned, because doing so would make his own reign seem more divinely ordained. Convenient, right? A tribunal was assembled, judges, theologians, witnesses. And slowly, piece by piece, the truth unraveled. Dozens of testimonies were gathered, from soldiers who fought beside her, priests who heard her confessions, villagers who remembered her childhood. The record grew thick with stories of her kindness, her courage, her unshakable faith. One priest confessed that he'd always known the trial was rigged. Another admitted he'd lied under pressure from the English. A soldier broke down while recounting her final prayer. The verdict was clear. Joan's trial had been a sham. Her execution a murder. She was officially exonerated in 1456, 25 years after her death. Her name was cleared. Her story rewritten from heretic to hero. But not everyone needed a document to believe that. For many, she'd already become more than real. Because here's the strange magic of Joan. Even in her absence, she lingered. Not just as a historical figure, but as a symbol that refused to fade. Villages erected shrines in her name. Children were named after her. Soldiers invoked her in battle cries. She became the blueprint for divine rebellion. A reminder that conviction can be louder than law, and sometimes the crown on a king's head was placed there by the hands of a peasant girl with mud on her boots. Let's pause and reflect on one mainstream fact here. No other woman in medieval Europe, especially one of such low birth, rose to such a position of military and spiritual prominence in the space of just 2 years. No royal blood, no formal education, no political backing, just belief, just fire. And yet, she left a mark deep enough to be debated, worshipped, and feared for centuries. Here's another chilling footnote. The very church that ordered her death would later canonize her. In 1920, 489 years after burning her at the stake, Joan of Arc was officially declared a saint by the Catholic Church. The same institution that once called her a sorceress now called her a divine messenger. Makes you wonder who really changed, the church or the narrative. And if you're wondering what her legacy looks like now, that is paintings, books, movies, even video games. She's appeared on coins and postage stamps. There's a feast day in her name. And she's been claimed by everyone from French nationalists to feminist scholars. But maybe the most powerful part of her legacy isn't in the metal or marble. It's in the idea that even a voice no one else hears can be loud enough to shake the world. That's what Joan believed. That's what terrified her enemies. And that's why, all these centuries later, we still talk about the girl who heard saints in the wheat fields of Domremy. We still remember her flame, not for how it killed her, but for how it refused to go out. The idea of Joan of Arc, the fearless peasant girl turned military commander, visionary, and eventual saint, continues to live far beyond the actual facts of her life. But rewind the timeline, and for much of her short existence she was viewed as a dangerous outlier, not a legend. And nowhere was that danger more apparent than in the courtrooms of her inquisitors. After the inquiry of 1456 cleared her name, people began to re-examine not just what Joan did, but how she did it. And it was unsettling. How did a teenage girl with no training or title lead armies? Why did seasoned generals take orders from her? Why did kings bend to her advice? Historians still argue whether her leadership was rooted in divine inspiration, natural charisma, or, possibly, a mix of early trauma and uncanny instinct. It's easy to forget that Joan came from a place where girls were married off by 15 and rarely left their villages. She instead rode into war. That's like handing your neighborhood babysitter the nuclear codes and saying, "Good luck, kid." And yet it worked. Her influence on the battlefield wasn't just symbolic. Troops said morale lifted when she was near. Sieges broke. Skirmishes turned in their favor. Even her banner became a rallying point. One soldier claimed just catching a glimpse of it made him believe God had arrived. That soldier later admitted he cried when he saw it fall at Paris. But Joan wasn't just a battlefield figure. In court, she turned legal battles into personal crusades. She never dodged a question, even when it could kill her. She gave answers like arrows. Quick, sharp, impossible to ignore. Here's a quirky historical tidbit. At one point during her trial, Joan told her judges that St. Catherine had warned her of their tricks. "She told me you'd try to trap me," Joan said. The room reportedly went silent. One scribe wrote that even the bishop shifted in his seat. And yet they kept going. They obsessed over her clothes. "Why do you wear a man's tunic?" they asked repeatedly, like medieval fashion police with a grudge. But it wasn't just clothing, it was a symbol, a refusal, a rejection of the roles assigned to her. Joan wore what allowed her to act, to ride, to fight, to survive. And that terrified the clergy more than any sword ever could. The church couldn't comprehend her. Not entirely. She didn't speak like a noblewoman, didn't defer to priests, didn't seek approval. She simply was raw, unapologetic, a human paradox wrapped in chainmail and humility. And they needed to put her back in her box. So they tried to frame her as prideful, possessed, a liar. But even when she stumbled, even when she briefly recanted, her conviction returned like a flame catching fresh wind. There was no middle ground with Joan. She was either touched by God, or something much darker. It's no surprise the English leaned toward the latter. Their fear of her was not subtle. One English commander called her the devil's minion. Another reportedly offered a bounty for whoever could capture her alive. Why alive? Because dead she would be a martyr. But broken, shamed, confessing to lies, that would undo everything. And it almost worked. But that heart, that famously unburned heart, tells a different story. Now fast forward to today, and Joan has become a canvas onto which we project all kinds of modern hopes and fears. She's been painted as a proto-feminist, a religious zealot, a political pawn, a queer icon, a mystic warrior. Everyone wants a piece of her. Few agree on who she really was. And maybe that's the point, because Joan's story was never meant to be clean or convenient. It's too messy, too human, too fiery. That's why she still haunts our collective imagination, not just for what she did, but for the way she did it. Without permission, without apology, and without waiting for someone else to save the world. One mainstream fact worth noting is that Joan's letters, several of which still survive, were often dictated in battle, signed with her personal monogram and sealed with a cross. She wrote to kings, bishops, enemy commanders. Once she even sent a letter demanding the English leave France immediately or face divine wrath. She was, in short, not subtle. And the replies? Usually panic, insults, or silence. Because what do you say to a girl who claims God is standing behind her? And maybe, just maybe, he is? What's even more haunting is that Joan never tried to start a movement. She wasn't building a church. She wasn't forming an army of followers. She didn't write manifestos. She never claimed to be special, just chosen. Which makes her story even scarier. Because if it could happen to her, it could happen again. One day you're herding sheep. the next you're hearing saints, and by the time the world notices, you're already on fire. As centuries passed, Joan of Arc's legacy only grew larger, stranger, and more contradictory, like a candle casting different shadows the longer it burns. The church that killed her declared her holy. The monarchy she once fought for forgot her, then claimed her. And entire nations took turns dressing her memory in whatever robes suited their current mood. But Joan herself? She never changed. Frozen in time. 19. Unbreakable. Still wearing armor in the minds of millions. And yet, behind that icon there's something much more human. More intimate. Because beyond the saints and the smoke and the swordplay, she was still just a girl. One who got scared, who felt pain, who cried. Cried. Witnesses at her execution said she wept openly. Not from fear of death, but for the church that condemned her. For the world she couldn't save. For the silence of her voices, which she claimed had already begun to fade. It's that loneliness that cuts deepest. Because while Joan stood in the public eye, she suffered in isolation. Her visions, whether divine or delusional, set her apart from everyone. Family, friends, allies. She belonged to no one. Not even herself. Here's a fringe historical detail. During one of her last interrogations, Joan asked that her ashes be buried in a church. A simple wish. Denied. Instead, they tossed what was left of her into the Seine, scattering her remains like they were afraid even her bones might speak. And maybe they were right, because her story refused to die. By the 19th century, Joan had become a rallying cry for France during wars of national pride. Statues sprang up. Schoolchildren memorized her speeches. Political factions from both the left and the right claimed her as their own. She was a unifying figure, except no one could agree what she represented. Was she a saint or a soldier? A rebel or a servant? A nationalist or a spiritual vessel? Historians still argue. In fact, some scholars insist she was mentally ill, possibly suffering from temporal lobe epilepsy, schizophrenia, or post-traumatic stress. Others say her visions match classic patterns of mystic experience across religious history. Still others shrug and say, whatever she had, it worked. Because no hallucination ever crowned a king and scared an empire. But what makes Joan's story even more chilling, more unforgettable, is this. She knew what would happen. Early in her campaign, Joan reportedly said, "I will last but a year or little more." And she was right. From the moment she entered public life to the day she died, just over 2 years passed. 2 years. That's all it took to go from a barefoot farm girl to a burned saint. One mainstream fact. Despite modern portrayals, Joan never actually killed anyone. She carried a sword, yes, but more often she carried a banner. She led from the front but struck no blow. The soldiers around her knew this. They said she fought not with steel but with certainty. And certainty can be more dangerous than a blade. Joan's execution was meant to silence her. But instead it made her louder. More than just remembered, resurrected. Artists painted her glowing with divine fire. Writers imagined her praying in dungeons, resisting temptation, staring down bishops with the calm of a holy storm. The playwright George Bernard Shaw called her the most marvelous person the human race has ever produced. Mark Twain, of all people, wrote a book about her. Even Napoleon had portraits made in her honor. Now here's a little-known oddity. During World War I, French soldiers in the trenches carried images of Joan for protection. She became a literal guardian for the modern battlefield, invoked in whispers before attacks, her likeness carved into trench walls beside crosses and prayers. That's how deep she got into the bones of a nation. But not just a nation. Because Joan's story isn't just France's story. It's human. It's universal. The idea that someone can rise from nothing, hold fast to an invisible truth, and speak it so loudly the world has no choice but to listen. That's terrifying, because it reminds us that power doesn't always come from thrones or armies. Sometimes it comes from a girl in worn boots who refuses to sit down. So yes, Joan was burned. Yes, her ashes were thrown to the river. But she never really left. Every time someone refuses to back down, speaks truth to power, risks ridicule for faith or vision or justice, they echo her. And whether or not saints whispered in her ear, the world has never stopped hearing her voice. The strangest part of Joan's story, perhaps, is that it ended so publicly. Flames in a marketplace, smoke climbing above the rooftops of Rouen, and yet it remained unfinished. Because what followed wasn't silence. It was obsession. The same society that once called her a heretic couldn't stop talking about her. In hushed tones in royal courts, in churches. Even those who feared her couldn't deny her impact. Even those who mocked her felt a little cold when they passed the place where she died. You can almost imagine the townspeople years later walking past that same square, looking away a little too quickly. As if fire left behind something that still whispered. Maybe it did. In the years that followed Joan's death, Europe itself began to shift. The 100 Years' War would slowly grind to an end, with France reclaiming much of its territory. Charles VII would go on to reign for 3 more decades. But he never really escaped the shadow of the girl who gave him his crown. There's something deeply unsettling about that. To owe your legacy to someone you abandoned. To walk into cathedrals knowing the person who made your coronation possible had to face fire alone. Charles never publicly repented. He never built her a monument. And yet his legitimacy, his throne, his history, was fused to her like iron to flame. Now here's a chilling historical footnote. The wooden stake where Joan was burned stood in Rouen's marketplace for years after her death. Not for remembrance, but as a warning, a threat, a reminder of what happens when people, especially women, dare to rise too high. It eventually rotted away. But by then Joan's legacy had already rooted itself in something much stronger. Memory. And memory doesn't rot. What's truly eerie is how Joan's story reappears in times of upheaval. During revolutions, people cite her courage. During occupations, her defiance. During dark times, her light. It's like she reemerges whenever the world tilts off balance, whispering, "Hold fast. Speak truth. Don't burn out." And here's where things get even stranger. Joan didn't leave behind relics. No bones. No burial site. No preserved sword. No crown. She didn't even have descendants. And yet she's more alive in historical imagination than many monarchs who had entire cathedrals built in their name. People paint her in stained glass. Name churches after her. Claim to see her face in dreams on battlefields, even in candle flames. Because Joan didn't need relics. She became one. One mainstream fact to remember. Joan's canonization in 1920 wasn't just a spiritual declaration. It was political. France had been through World War I, lost millions, and needed heroes again. Joan fit perfectly. She was brave, holy, French, and safely dead for 5 centuries. Always a bonus. The ceremony was held in St. Peter's Basilica. Cardinals in red. Choirs in white. Echoes ringing through marble arches. And somewhere perhaps a ghost smiling. Because here was the final irony. The same church that killed her now elevated her to sainthood, apologizing across the centuries in the most elaborate way possible. And yet, it still doesn't feel like enough, does it? A saint's title is a ribbon on a wound. A crown after a guillotine. Because what Joan wanted wasn't sainthood. She wanted France free. Her king crowned. Her voices honored. And maybe, just maybe, to go home again. To walk through Domremy one last time. To smell her mother's bread baking in the hearth. To hear wheat rustle in the wind without wondering if it's a saint or a soldier coming through the field. But that never happened. Joan never returned home. And her family, humble farmers, spent their lives trying to clear her name. Her mother, Isabel, even testified during the rehabilitation trial. Imagine that. A mother 20 years after the flames, still begging the world to see her daughter not as a witch, but as someone chosen. Holy. Good. And perhaps that's the most haunting image of all. Not the fire. Not the chains. But a mother standing before a courtroom, trembling, remembering her child not in glory, but in pain. Because Joan didn't die for show. She died because people couldn't make sense of her. Couldn't control her. Couldn't place her neatly into the roles they expected. And maybe in the end that's what she was always meant to do. Refuse the box. Defy the script. Walk out of history barefoot and shining, leaving only the echo of hooves, a flicker of flame, and a name the world would never forget. Joan. If there's one thing that makes Joan's story different from the average martyr tale, it's this. Her end wasn't meant to inspire. It was meant to erase. The fire that consumed her in Rouen wasn't just execution. It was deletion. A medieval Control plus Alt plus Delete. But someone forgot to press confirm. Because somehow Joan didn't vanish. She multiplied. In paintings. In poems. In propaganda. In prayer. And in that strange, foggy corner of the human imagination reserved for the ones who aren't supposed to exist, but do anyway. Centuries after her death, Joan began showing up in unexpected places. In London, Shakespeare wrote of her, not as a saint but a villain. In Henry VI, Part 1, she's La Pucelle, a witch and deceiver. English audiences of the 1590s were still bitter, apparently, and yet even in that portrayal she crackles with power. She never begs, never cowers. She dies spitting fire, if not literally then verbally. Even her enemies couldn't write her weak. Mainstream historians now agree that Joan's transformation from condemned heretic to national heroine was one of the most radical image flips in Western history. One century she's a cautionary tale. A few centuries later she's draped in heavenly light. Talk about a posthumous rebrand. Here's a quirky cultural detail. During the 1800s, the women's suffrage movement in France and Britain sometimes invoked Joan as a symbol of female courage and divine conviction. Posters featured her in gleaming armor under slogans like "She fought for France," "We fight for our rights." Imagine explaining that to Bishop Cauchon. And it didn't stop there. In 1999, Time magazine included her in their list of the most important people of the millennium. Let that sink in. Out of 1,000 years of inventors, emperors, explorers, and conquerors, Joan of Arc, a teenage shepherd, made the cut. Because her story doesn't belong to just one era, or one nation, or even one interpretation. It slips through fingers like smoke, too solid to ignore, too strange to explain. Even skeptics admit she's a historical anomaly, a meteor that appeared in the sky and then vanished, leaving behind just enough dust to confuse astronomers for centuries. And yet, there's one thread that runs through it all: the voices. Whether they were divine, delusional, or deeply intuitive, they shaped her every step. They told her when to fight, when to speak, when to kneel, and when to burn. Some scholars argue that Joan's unwavering faith in these voices is what made her powerful. That belief itself was the weapon. Because people will follow a sword, sure, but they'll follow certainty even faster. And that's what Joan offered. Certainty. That France could be saved. That kings weren't untouchable. That a girl in homespun clothes could rewrite fate. And that's what made her dangerous. Not her armor. Not her saints. Not her banner. Her certainty. And certainty scares the powerful. Always has. Because it's unpredictable. It doesn't ask permission. It doesn't negotiate. It just is. That's why she had to be destroyed. And that's why it didn't work. Now here's something you might not expect. There are over 20,000 books written about Joan of Arc. 20,000. More than many Roman emperors. More than most US presidents. More than Napoleon even. And each book tries in its own way to answer the same impossible question. Who was she really? A holy warrior? A political pawn? A mystic? A fraud? A feminist icon centuries before the word existed? And the answer is always yes. And also, not quite. Because Joan doesn't fit. She wasn't meant to. She's not a puzzle piece, she's the part of the puzzle that makes you throw the box away and stare at the table for an hour. She is the exception that doesn't prove the rule. And maybe that's why we still whisper about her before bed. Why we stare at her statues a little longer than we intend to. Why we tell her story to children, not to comfort them but to haunt them gently. Because deep down we know, this isn't just history. It's a warning. That faith can be louder than fire. That truth doesn't kneel. And that sometimes when the voices call, someone actually listens. You'd think that after nearly 6 centuries, Joan of Arc's story would feel distant. Old. Tucked safely behind glass in a museum, or bound up in leather books with gold-embossed spines. But no. It still walks beside us. And maybe that's the most unsettling part. Because unlike most historical figures, Joan didn't leave behind institutions. She didn't build an empire, didn't write a doctrine. She didn't even leave behind her bones. All she left was a memory and a question. What if she was right? What if the voices weren't madness? What if France really was saved by a girl who talked to saints in a field of wheat? That's what keeps her close. That glimmer of possibility. And yet, for all that's been written, all that's been sung and sculpted and whispered in her name, there's still something missing. Something no biography or hagiography can quite capture. Her silence. Because after the stake burned down, after the fire hissed out in the cobblestones of Rouen, there were no last letters. No dying declarations. No final speeches carved into cell walls. Joan left her ending blank. And the world has been trying to write it ever since. Mainstream historians often struggle with her because she doesn't fit the expected molds. She wasn't born into privilege. She didn't gradually rise through ranks. She just appeared, fully formed, burning with conviction, disrupting everything. And then just as suddenly she was gone. It's that sharp, fast arc, like a lightning bolt, that makes her unforgettable. And maybe a little frightening. Here's a lesser-known historical tidbit. During her trial, one of the judges asked her if she knew she would be captured. Joan answered, "Yes. My voices told me I would be taken. But I do not fear. I did not fear. I do not fear." Even in shackles, even with death creeping up the hallway, she wasn't afraid. And that's what broke them. Because what do you do with someone who won't flinch? Someone who doesn't back down even as you tie the rope? Someone who says, "Light the fire, I'm ready." They thought fire would stop her. But instead it turned her into smoke. Into legend. Into a question that never really closes. And in the centuries that followed, people began hearing her voice again. Not the saints this time, but her. In revolutions, people shouted her name from rooftops. In poems, she whispered between the lines. In dreams, she came in armor, eyes glowing, lips silent. And always that same quiet question beneath it all. What if I'm meant for something more? Because that's the echo she leaves behind. Not fear. Not pity. Possibility. That even if you're poor or strange or unheard, the world might turn at your footsteps. That one girl with a banner and an unshakable voice can change the course of history. And that thought, that idea, it's dangerous. Which is why Joan is more than a bedtime story. She's a test. She asks, what do you believe in? And how far are you willing to go for it? Because she went all the way. From Domremy's fields to the walls of Orleans. From the throne room of Reims to the flames of Rouen. She never stopped. Never apologized. Never turned her face from the voices. And even now, centuries later, she still hasn't really disappeared. She's in every whisper of rebellion. Every refusal to kneel. Every quiet act of courage that defies the expected and chooses the divine instead. So the next time you hear a voice, strange, quiet, undeniable, don't ignore it too quickly. Because it might be madness. But it might be a miracle. And you'll never know which until it's too late to turn back. And so we arrive at the final flicker of Joan's fire. A light not snuffed out, but transformed. No longer a flame in a marketplace, but something softer now. A glow behind stained glass. A hush in a chapel. A name murmured in the dark. Joan of Arc. The girl who led armies without lifting a sword. The girl who wore armor not to kill, but to believe. The girl who faced a courtroom of cowards and answered with nothing but truth. She was born into obscurity, died in agony, and lived somehow beyond both. What makes Joan's story so unsettling isn't just the fire or the trial or the betrayal. It's the feeling that it could happen again. That somewhere in some village with dirt roads and candlelight, another girl might be hearing voices. Might be getting ready to change the world while no one's watching. And no matter how many centuries pass, her story still knocks on the back of your mind and asks, what would you have done? Would you have followed her? Would you have doubted her? Would you have stayed silent as the smoke rose? There's no easy answer. That's part of the power. Because Joan isn't just a person anymore. She's a mirror. And in her reflection we see not sainthood, but the shape of what we fear most and need most at once. Unshakable belief. Belief that doesn't bend to fear. belief that survives betrayal, belief that lights up the dark, even when the match is your own body. Now here's one last detail to carry with you. In 1909, during her beatification, Pope Pius X called Joan a young girl who astonished the world. Not commanded it, not ruled it, just astonished it. And maybe that's the most accurate of all. Because when the world expects silence and a voice sings out instead, that's astonishing. When fire expects screams and it receives prayer, that's astonishing. When power expects submission and it meets defiance wrapped in faith, that's Joan. And she still walks among us. Not in armor, but in the unyielding steps of anyone who says no. I was made for more. Now close your eyes. Picture her not at the stake, but riding beneath an open sky, a banner in her hand and a song in her throat. No chains, no judges, no fire, only wind and light and the sound of hooves fading into the distance. Let it all settle now. The voices, the fire, the banners, the silence. Let the image of Joan dissolve slowly, like morning mist on the fields of Domremy. You followed her through battlefields and courtrooms, through fire and betrayal, through unshakable faith and unbearable loss. And now you can rest, because she has finished her story for tonight. Breathe in deeply. Let the embers fade. Let the heavy robes of history slip from your shoulders like ash. This is the quiet after the storm, the stillness after the prayer. You are safe now, in your bed, in your room, in your time, far from dungeons, far from darkness, and yet just close enough to feel the echo of her footfall. Soft, steady, resolute. You don't have to carry her burden, just her light. So as you drift, remember, she wasn't a myth. She wasn't a fairy tale. She was real. And she walked where none dared walk before. Let that be enough. Let it lull you into rest, into stillness, into peace. You've walked a long path tonight. Now it's time to sleep. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts float. Let the night carry you gently away from the fire and into the stars. Joan's story is finished, and your dreams are waiting.